Hi, welcome to this third session on economics. Now we're going to study the introduction to macroeconomics. We have seen in the previous two chapters how microeconomics works and what is the importance of microeconomics in the context that we are looking at as far as the test is concerned. So very important to kind of note that when you studied microeconomics, we were looking at firms, we were looking at households, we're looking at workers at individual units, and we saw how they interacted, they made decisions on what to purchase, how much to produce, so on. So macroeconomics, on the contrary, looks at concepts like economic growth. It's a way we need to measure the growth in a country, inflation, unemployment rates, international trade, fiscal and monetary policies. Not necessarily in that order, but these are the key things that we will look at when we study macroeconomics. Important from the perspective of how the country runs. So you see that the government's intervention in the economy is very critical, and government has a lot of these parameters to keep in check. It must ensure that unemployment is not very high, right? Or people have a lot of employment opportunities, must make sure that the inflation is not high, so on. So what do we do? So since you look at the economy as a whole, so whenever we talk about macroeconomics, we are looking at this entire aggregate, right? As a country, we are looking at all the firms, all the producers, all the consumers, and trying to make judgments based on this and study based on this. So if you actually look at any economy, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity. Heterogeneity means a lot of differences at individual level, at firm level. It is practically impossible to aggregate how each person behaves and put them together as one picture. So what do? So we look at some concept called as representative agent, right? And this is, when we talk about representative agent, it is like, imagine that, assume great number of many of consumers and firms in the economy, each of which is identical to other firms in a different way. Take example, suppose you're working studying agricultural sector. So lots of companies, lots of firms that are operating in the agriculture sector probably behave in a similar manner. Similarly, the IT sector. So we actually aggregate these entities together and see if we can study them as a one individual or one group. The reason why we do it is, in order we aggregate sector wise, right, is to create a ease of studying the economy. So what do? I mean I've taken a broad kind of sectoral approach, which is saying you could look at companies or organizations or firms that are operating in the primary sector, in the secondary sector, tertiary sector, club them together, see how these sectoral companies together are behaving, and that gives us a very good perspective, because the moment you put them into sectors, you will see that there are things that are native, और हर सेक्टर में अपना अपना तरीका होता है ऑपरेट करने का. जैसे डिफरेंट टेक्नोलॉजीज होंगे, प्रोडक्शन, the production characteristics, automobile sector, right? Probably the entire automobile and auto ancillary sector might behave similarly, and also the general price level. So there is some kind of a homogeneity, uniformity that we bring into picture, and hence we will be able to study and make decisions on this in a much representative level. So इसीलिए हम सारे companies, firms in the economy, producers in the economy, we break them into sectors. So this is called a sectoral approach of looking at the economy of the country. So now if you actually look at why did macroeconomics come into picture, right? What was the need to study macroeconomics? We know that the father of economics, you can say, is Adam Smith. And Adam Smith said that Adam Smith was a very big proponent, big supporter of free market. उसका कहना था कि अगर आप sellers जो produce करते हैं, बेचना चाहते हैं, and buyers, right? If you let them operate, right, on completely selfish interest, which means every person is trying to take the best out of what he or she can get. So if you let them do it, then there is no need for anybody to intervene. This process itself, he said, will generate wealth and welfare for the entire economy, the entire country, entire state. But in reality, there were some issues. What were the issues? There are some places where no markets developed. So when you are allowing free market, you are basically saying that free markets में ये है कि let the market behave the way they want. Market will, you will find sellers, buyers getting together, and sellers will sell to buyers at the price that the buyers are willing to pay, and sellers are also willing to pay. But that's the market establishment. उसी को हम कहते हैं market. But there are many instances जहाँ पे market possible ही नहीं है, right? Or the market does not develop. For example, if you want to think of an airline, right? In a country there is a small island and you want airline services to operate to that island, right? And you find that there might be a situation where the companies may not be willing to operate because they don't make much profit, because there is not much traffic on the routes. So the market may not establish in the first place. So that's one reason why markets are not always efficient. No markets. Even if the markets do establish themselves, maybe there's no equilibrium that is happening. So there might be instances where the government will have to come and establish, or state will have to establish some equilibrium. For example, there could be a demand but there's no supply, right? Or there could be excess supply but there's no demand. So somebody comes in picture. For example, take an agricultural commodity. Let's say the production was fantastic of potatoes or wheat, but there is not so much demand. So who comes in? Normally the way it happens in India and many countries around the world is the government probably comes in, steps in and says, don't worry, I will buy this, right? So the market may not exist by itself. So the government may have to intervene to create that market. So the equilibrium is not necessarily established. The third is social goals. You leave everything to the markets to operate on a selfish goals, which is what free market is about, right? Selfish, there is nothing, I mean, we are not talking moral thing here about selfish. Everybody is trying to do what is best for him or her. The firms are trying to make the highest profits. The consumers are trying to get the best benefit out of it, right? And hence, they may not think of things like defense of the country. Nobody, it's not under anybody's radar. कोई ये intervene करके यहाँ पे market बनाना नहीं चाहेगा. Employment, right? Not everybody is probably looking at employment. If you look at public sector units in India, right? When they were established, one of the objectives was to create employment. But if you look at a free market system, the free market system says, I don't need so many people. Maybe employment is not the objective of, let's say, the free market system. Similarly, health, will they invest in health? Will they invest in education? That may not happen because that may not mean the best profits for them. So since these markets are not necessarily efficient, right, the study of macroeconomics is very critical, because macro study also involves many things like wages, employment, right? Look at money supply, look at output, taxation policies, fiscal policies of the government, rate of interest. These are some of the parameters, not necessarily the all set of parameters, but these are some of the major policy issues or policy parameters that any macro study will involve. Now, what are the characteristics of any macroeconomic study, right? You will see that broadly there are two decision makers. One is, rather it is, I wouldn't say two decision makers, it's obviously the markets, the consumers are one, but one of the biggest players in the macroeconomic study would be the role of governments. तो गवर्नमेंट का जो रोल है, while you are studying microeconomics, you did not study about it. You studied about the firms, you studied about the consumers, and you saw how the two were interacting with each other with a very simple perspective कि मेरे लिए क्या सही है, what is the best for me. However, one of the biggest decision makers that you would see is the role of governments in ensuring macroeconomic stability. So you see the government comes in. Government also has a lot of regulatory bodies. You can still call that the state, right? So the SEBI, RBI, and all of these, right, are essentially entities that are set up for governing the country, and they become very critical part of the macroeconomic study. And they are mandated, right? उनका जो instruction दिया हुआ है according to Constitution of India कि you must ensure this, this, this. So the government's intervention, government का जो role है macroeconomics में बहुत ही critical है. Then you talk about the objectives. So the government's role, it comes in picture because there are some objectives that are very critical. One is about the public need and welfare, right? Are you taking care of the people in the economy, right? Are the poor, is the government or the policies of the government enabling the poor to become better off, right? And is it redeploying the resource deployment, right? Reallocation. आप tax कहीं से लेते हो, कहीं और invest करते हो to make sure that everybody in the economy or in the country kind of become well-to-do, right? So that's one of the very important objectives of the government. So you see that public needs, roads, everything, welfare, making sure that everybody is well off or you take care of the people. And the critical way that they go about doing this is to ensure that the resource deployment is done in the most efficient manner ताकि सब लोग everybody is benefiting from that. A little bit of the history, देखिए कब शुरू हुआ इस story of studying macroeconomics is it happened with what is called as a Great Depression in the United States of America and Europe, right? But the biggest effect or the first effect you could feel was in the US. So there is controversy, nobody knows exactly what started it off, but one of the beliefs is that there was a stock market crash in 1929 in the US, and the general feeling is that probably that was what triggered, right? That was one of the reasons why the Great Depression happened. So that affected significantly not only the world around, but definitely a significant part of it was in North America and Europe. What happened during the Great Depression was the output almost dropped by about almost 1/3, almost 30% drop, and hence led to great amount of unemployment. And so the earlier thinking was that if you wanted a job, right, the markets will provide the job. तो ये जो employment वाला story था कि the earlier economists always believed कि अगर आपको कोई नौकरी चाहिए, नौकरी मिल जाएगा, आपको बस you must be ready to work. But this was a situation that was new, where there were lots and lots of people willing to work, but they did not get the jobs. So that's what we mean by new economic thinking. That meant that we need to do a little more. So this is where there's a very famous British economist called John Maynard Keynes, and we talk about Keynesian policy, right? Keynesian policy, right? And that is taking away from the name Keynes, right? John Maynard Keynes, he is a British economist whose ideas fundamentally changed macroeconomic practice, and he is also credited with some suggestions, some consulting that he gave to the governments in order that these governments could come out of the Great Depression. So he believed that, right, aggregate demand determined the overall level of economy, and he also believed that government must intervene. तब तक government का intervention की बात कभी हुआ नहीं है, right? So the study of how governments can impact the economy was not done or was almost ignored. I wouldn't say that it was not done. It would have obviously been done in small ways, but it was not considered very important. It was not studied in depth. So Keynes came and he did a lot of studies. He looked at what are the lasting effects of unemployment. He did a lot of study on employment and unemployment. Then he also looked at how different sectors are interdependent in the economy. It's not as if every sector behaves in its own way, but there's an interdependence. If one sector goes down, probably it will also impact the other sector. So this sectoral interdependence is something that he studied, and he kind of did a lot of research and a lot of work on studying the economy as a whole. Now, just to kind of conclude this, right? We must know whenever we are talking about macroeconomics or microeconomics, a lot of these things are keeping a capitalistic economy in mind, right? So it's not. So the other end of it could be a completely government-owned, government-operated economies like communist countries. So some of the policies that we talk about will not probably be relevant, right? Will not be exactly applicable in some of the communist countries, right? Though if you look at China, China was one great example of a completely communist country, now going a little closer to a free market economy because of certain initiatives they took in the early 80s. So when you think of a capitalist economy has this characteristic. It's got private ownership, which means people can own land, they can own factors of, they can own firms, right? Production units, right? Whereas in a communist country, you cannot do that. I mean, the government owns everything. So then you have the people who run the show, right? The entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial thing that we talk about. Entrepreneurs are the people who ensure that the resources that are available are put to best use, and they produce to sell, to make profits, and whatever profits that they are going to make, right, they try to make sure that in order to enable or in order to make sure कि अगले साल the year after that, right, if you think of any subsequent years, in order to make sure that the productive capacity, the ability to produce, right, produce करने का आपका जो you need that strength to produce every year after year. That is what the entrepreneurs do. They kind of take the profits, put it as investments, and that enables productive capacity for the subsequent years. So capitalist economy में जब हम लोग पढ़ते हैं, we broadly look at three elements. One is the firms, the governments, and the households. Households are you and me. In fact, firms ultimately might be people who might be members of households who actually might be owning the firms. But firms as an entity, how it behaves, might be very different from how you and I will behave while buying some things or managing our money. Now, firm's motive is to produce and make profit. That's the motive, simple motive. And what do? They use factors of production, जो हम कहते हैं land, labor, capital, right? And in exchange for land for rent, right? Labor for wages. So I mean, as a return for me giving my efforts to make sure that the production is happening, the firm will give me wages, right? So this is all, whatever is in the brackets here is in return for capital, in return for interest. So that's the cost of capital. So you take money, you take loan from someone to invest in something, build up a firm. Obviously, in return for that, you have to give that person interest. And what they end up making out of this is profits to the entrepreneurs, right? So so there is an entrepreneur. Entrepreneur is running the firm, right? He is giving his buddhi, right, in order to make sure that the firm does well. So the profits, part of the profits, or maybe the entire profits, depending on how the firm is organized, will go to him or her, and they invest whatever are part of the profits, right, for future use in terms of investing in new capacities, building up new plants, so on. The role of the government is very important, is to frame laws, enforce them, and ensure that there is justice in the country as such. Why is this important from economy perspective? One is, if the rule of the land is not dependable, people will not invest, right? For example, if you hear of the word how friendly a country is to investment, right? So if you ease of doing business ki baat karte hain, right? There, one of the things that comes in is the country, does it go by the law of land, or it is like anybody can come in and say, oh, no law is valid, and what I'm saying is the gospel truth? That doesn't, that should not happen, and that is the role of the, so there are laws, it must frame the laws, write laws to encourage economy, enforce whatever they have framed, and ensure that there is fairness in the way how the justice system works in the economy. So they also, the role of the government is also ensure that they collect taxes, right? That's the return for the services the government does, right? They collect taxes. Taxes is also another way of reallocating the resources. You are taking money from the rich and ensuring that it is spread a little more evenly across the country and putting it into public goods, and sometimes in the case of India also into production, right? For example, the public sector units, all these are places where the government has invested money as a part of the production. The households essentially provide the factors of production to the firms, provide land, labor, capital, and enterprise, and they also are one of the critical elements of consumption, right? If you look at India's GDP, you will see that India's GDP, close to 60% of India's GDP comes from consumption. Consumption का मतलब आप साबुन खरीद रहे हो, आप टूथपेस्ट खरीद रहे हो, you're buying bikes, buying cars, all these are part of our consumption. So that element, that constitutes close to about 60% of India's GDP. So this is a broad view that you must know, right? And a lot of what we are going to study subsequently also as lot of, as all linkages with the capitalistic economies, right? And is there a truly capitalistic economy in the country, in the world? Maybe not, right? Because even if you look at USA, which is considered probably closest to a free market, there are a lot of government intervention, socialistic policies, right, that come in. But yes, if there is a closer to the closest, you could say, to the capitalist economy, that probably is the US. A lot of other economies are actually mixed economies, where there is a free market operating and also the government intervention coming into picture. So in the next sector, which is beyond this, is the external sector, which is like the import-export market, right? This doesn't operate within the country, but it is exchange of goods across the borders. So you see that when you look at the external sector, there are two elements that we see. You import from outside, you export to the outside markets. So that's one thing. The other thing is you get inflows of investment from outside. People invest, people in US, other Hong Kong, and all these markets, Singapore, and all those people, they come and invest in the Indian markets, right? And there are lots of Indians who go and invest outside. If you look at Tatas or Birlas and any of this, they have got investments, huge investments outside of India. They produce outside of India. So that's the fourth sector, and we will, these four sectors, study of these four sectors, right, is something that we are going to look at when we talk about macroeconomics. So we'll stop here. In the next session, we'll talk about how we look at national income accounting.